The jungle heat pressed down like a living weight, thick and heavy enough to choke the breath from anyone who wasn't used to it. The air smelled of damp earth, gun oil and sweat, the kind of mix that clung to skin and uniforms and refused to let go. Somewhere in that dense canopy the Navy SEALs had their perimeters set up, rifles resting on sandbags, eyes scanning the trail that led into the kill zone. They had been given a simple directive: hold the ground, secure the hostage route, and neutralize any threat that approached. For the men who had lived and trained for war, it was just another line of duty. Yet, beneath their confidence, a subtle tension ran through them like an invisible current, because the orders had included something unusual. They weren't facing an enemy army, insurgents, or cartel gunmen. They were facing one person. And she was coming straight into their line of fire. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Cross, was a man hardened by 2 decades of missions, his jaw set like stone beneath the shade of his helmet. He had scoffed earlier in the day when the local interpreter had warned them about her. A woman, they said. Not a fighter by profession, not a trained soldier. A simple woman. She had no right to step into a war zone, and certainly no ability to survive it. Cross had laughed at the notion, shaking his head as he paced near the sandbags, boots pressing into the dirt. No one can hit that target, he had muttered earlier, dismissing the idea that she could possibly pose a threat or accomplish what men with years of training couldn't. His words weren't bravado. They were certainty. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that when she entered the kill zone she would fold, stumble, or be cut down in seconds. And yet, when the sun slid low and the shadows of the trees stretched long, she came. She didn't wear armor, nor did she carry the kind of heavy equipment the SEALs bore. She wasn't weighted down by tactical radios or night vision goggles. Instead, she stepped into the path with calm, steady strides, wearing little more than dust-streaked fatigues and a rifle that looked decades old. Her hair was tied back in a rough knot, face smudged with dirt, eyes dark and unflinching. She didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't try to intimidate. She simply walked as if the ground beneath her boots belonged to her and no one else could claim it. The silence that followed was heavier than the jungle air itself. SEAL rifles rose in unison, laser dots scattering like red fireflies across her chest, but she did not slow. Cross narrowed his eyes from behind the scope, finger resting near the trigger guard, but something in her expression gave him pause. Fearless wasn't the word. Fearless implied recklessness, a kind of mad charge into danger. What he saw in her face was something colder, sharper. It was inevitability. The command had been clear: if she crossed the line she was to be stopped. Yet, as she took another step and another, the team hesitated. Not because they lacked discipline, but because something about her presence unsettled them. It was as if every man there understood instinctively that she was not walking into the kill zone without reason. She wasn't suicidal. She wasn't ignorant. She knew exactly what she was doing. And when her eyes lifted, sweeping over the line of hidden soldiers, it felt as though she could see through the brush, through the camouflage, through every ounce of stealth they had built into their ambush. It wasn't bravado, it was awareness, a predator's sense of where every other predator lay waiting. One SEAL muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the man beside him to hear, "She knows we're here." His partner didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his palms slick on his weapon. The jungle seemed to grow quieter with every step she took. When she finally stopped, it was in the very center of the kill zone. Every rifle was trained on her. Cross exhaled slowly, squeezing his scope tighter against his eye. "This is it," he whispered to himself. But then she did something none of them expected. With calm precision, she raised her rifle, not wildly, not hurriedly, but with the same deliberate care of a sniper who had all the time in the world. Her movements were fluid, steady, honed by repetition rather than training manuals. The kind of skill that came from surviving, not practicing. The SEAL officer scoffed again, louder this time, his voice tinged with annoyance at her audacity. "No one can hit that," he muttered to the man beside him. Yet even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. She wasn't aiming at them. She wasn't aiming at the line. Her barrel tracked upward, toward a ridge far above, where a hidden lookout had been stationed. A man none of the SEALs had noticed, a sniper positioned with perfect advantage. And before Cross could even process what was happening, she fired. The shot cracked through the still air, rolling like thunder across the trees. Birds scattered in a frenzy, leaves rustled violently, and then silence returned, sharper and heavier than before. A second later, a body tumbled from the ridge above, crashing through the foliage, rifle clattering uselessly beside him. Every head in the kill zone snapped upward, then back to her. She had just revealed the one threat that none of their intel had accounted for, the one hidden gun that could have ended them all. And she had done it without fear, without hesitation, with a shot that looked impossible. The officer's words echoed in his own ears, bitter now. No one can hit that. But she had. And as her gaze dropped back down to meet theirs, there was no triumph, no arrogance. Just certainty. She knew she could, and she had proven it with a single pull of the trigger. For a moment no one spoke. The SEALs held their breath, torn between admiration and unease. Cross lowered his rifle slightly, his jaw tightening. He wanted to believe it was luck, that she had stumbled into that miracle shot, that she wasn't what she seemed. But deep down he already knew better. A woman who entered a kill zone without fear wasn't relying on luck. She was relying on something else entirely, something stronger, sharper, more dangerous than even his most seasoned operators carried. He felt the weight of it pressing down on the team like the jungle heat, making them shift, making them question. And for the first time in a long while, the lieutenant realized he was no longer certain of victory. The silence that followed stretched so long it felt like a taut wire about to snap. The SEALs were trained for chaos, for sudden explosions of violence, not for this one unarmed standoff that left their discipline hanging by a thread. Cross finally barked into his radio, his voice low but tight with command, ordering his men to hold position. He didn't want panic fire, not after what had just happened. The fallen sniper's body was proof enough that underestimating her was dangerous. He kept his gaze through the scope, studying her posture, her eyes, every subtle angle of her stance. She wasn't even breathing hard, wasn't twitching or shifting nervously the way untrained shooters did after their first kill. No, she stood there like she'd seen it all before, like one more body in the dirt meant nothing more than another day in her life. That unnerved him more than the shot itself. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the quiet like a knife, calm, unshaken, carrying just enough weight to reach the men. Hidden behind brush and steel. "I don't need to fight you," she said. "You've already lost if you don't see what's right in front of you." Her words weren't shouted, weren't meant to intimidate. They carried the certainty of someone who knew the ground, the terrain, the game better than any of them. One of the younger SEALs, crouched just behind his sandbag post, muttered, "What the hell does that mean?" His partner shook his head, gripping his rifle tighter. Cross ignored them, narrowing his focus on her face. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't playing games. She was trying to tell them something, and he didn't like that one bit. The lieutenant made a decision. He pushed back from his cover and stood tall enough for her to see him clearly through the foliage, though his rifle stayed fixed in his hands. If she wanted to rattle his team, he wasn't going to let her keep the psychological advantage. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, voice steady, amplified just enough by the radio mic to echo through the clearing. "Step back the way you came." Last warning. He expected resistance or maybe a plea, but she did neither. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost as if studying him the same way he studied her, and gave the faintest shake of her head. Then she shifted her rifle, not in his direction, not toward his men, but toward the jungle floor, and fired again. The round slammed into the ground barely a foot from where one of his men lay hidden. Instantly the soldier cursed and jerked back, brushing away dirt that had sprayed across his face. But Cross froze, realizing she hadn't missed. She had hit something buried just beneath the surface. The muffled metallic clang was unmistakable. His stomach sank. Mines. She had just revealed what they had walked over, crawled past, and set their perimeter atop. Mines buried deep enough that even their scanners must have missed them. His men glanced at one another, the fear sharp now in their eyes. If she had wanted them dead, she could have triggered a chain reaction by targeting the right pressure plate. Instead, she had chosen to demonstrate. She could end them, but she didn't. The message was clear. Their tactical superiority was already compromised. Cross clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. "Hold position," he barked, but even he could feel the fracture line running through his squad's morale. Doubt was creeping in fast, replacing the iron confidence that usually anchored them. She wasn't firing wildly, wasn't taking shots at them. She was proving she saw what they didn't. That kind of control was more dangerous than any number of bullets. He lifted his radio to his mouth, ordering the rear comms unit to run a sweep on the ground. Moments later the report came back clipped and tense. "Multiple signatures, sir. Looks like old Soviet mines scattered all through the approach." Cross cursed under his breath. That ridge sniper hadn't been the only invisible threat out there. And she had walked straight through it as though she knew every step was safe. One of the men whispered, just loud enough for Cross to catch, "How the hell did she make it through that alive?" That was the question gnawing at him too. Mines didn't spare people. They weren't selective. Yet she had crossed the zone without hesitation, without triggering a single one. Either she had a map or she had knowledge that went far deeper than anything their intel had provided. Cross lowered his scope at last, stepping fully into view. The risk was calculated. If she wanted him dead, she could have taken the shot already. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, voice sharp. She held his gaze, eyes steady and unreadable, and said simply, "The one who knows the cost of your arrogance." Her words hit harder than any rifle crack. Cross bristled, his pride stung, but a sliver of unease slid deeper into him. He had faced warlords, insurgents, mercenaries, men who lived for blood and power, but none of them had rattled him with so few words. He realized then that her strength didn't come from firepower or numbers. It came from something older, something carved by survival in places no SEAL team had been ordered to tread. She wasn't challenging them for dominance. She was reminding them they weren't the only predators in the jungle. And as the thought settled in, the first distant sound of movement whispered through the trees. Cross turned sharply, raising his rifle again, but it wasn't her. It was shadows moving at the edges of the perimeter, figures slipping silently between the branches. His comms crackled with the watchman's report: "Contact, multiple signatures, closing in from the east and south." The lieutenant's blood ran cold. They had been so focused on her that they hadn't seen what she had bought time for. Reinforcements, whether friends, allies or something else entirely, were converging on their position. And she had walked into the kill zone not to challenge them alone, but to hold their attention until the rest could arrive. Cross whipped his gaze back to her, but she hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the kill zone, rifle at her side, expression calm, as though everything unfolding around them was inevitable. The SEALs shifted nervously, scanning their sectors, guns swiveling, fingers tightening on triggers. The jungle was no longer quiet. The sound of rustling branches and distant footsteps pressed in from every direction. Cross felt the sting of realization bite deeper than pride ever had. He hadn't just underestimated her skill, he had underestimated her purpose. She wasn't here to fight a war against them head-on. She was here to prove that their training, their arrogance, their belief in superiority could be dismantled by someone who understood the ground, the threats, the unseen dangers better than they ever could. And as the first shadow broke through the tree line, Cross knew with grim certainty that the woman who had entered the kill zone without fear had just turned the battlefield into hers. The jungle seemed to breathe heavier as the shadows closed in. Cross's instinct screamed at him to pull his men back, to regroup and re-establish control, but pride and training held him rooted to the ground. The SEALs had never been forced into retreat by one person, let alone a woman who carried herself with nothing but certainty and a rifle older than their youngest recruit. Yet as the first of the approaching figures broke from the treeline, he realized this was no ordinary ambush. They weren't soldiers in uniform, nor insurgents with ragged gear. They were villagers, men and women, some young, some gray-haired, moving with a unity that was unnatural for civilians. Their weapons were mismatched, battered rifles, machetes, even bows, but the way they moved was tight, deliberate, practiced. This was no mob. This was a network. And she stood at the center of it all like their keystone. The SEALs tensed, rifles rising in unison, but none fired. Cross raised a clenched fist, signaling them to hold. He wasn't blind to the optics of the moment. Shooting unarmed villagers, or even armed ones who hadn't yet attacked, would unravel every rule of engagement they lived by. Yet the woman's presence twisted the situation into something different. This wasn't a random crowd. It was a force called into existence by her confidence, her defiance. He could see it in their eyes as they stepped into view. They weren't afraid because she wasn't afraid. Fear didn't ripple out from her, and so it didn't ripple through them. That kind of control was more dangerous than bullets. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the eyes of the first villagers arriving, and gave the faintest nod. No orders shouted, no commands barked, but they adjusted, spreading out in a loose semicircle that cut off the SEALs' retreat routes. Cross cursed silently. This was no coincidence. She had known exactly how long it would take them to arrive, how to time her walk through the kill zone to the second. The discipline, the precision, it reminded him of something he'd seen before in war zones where the enemy wasn't just an enemy but a culture, a people who had lived with conflict long enough to make resistance instinct. He didn't want to admit it, but she had just outmaneuvered the best-trained team on the ground without firing a shot in their direction. The younger SEALs shifted nervously, sweat dripping down, faces streaked with camouflage paint. One of them whispered, "Sir, permission to fire?" Cross's hand shot up sharply, cutting him off. He could feel the weight of dozens of villagers' eyes on him now, and one wrong move would ignite the entire clearing into bloodshed. "Negative," he said through gritted teeth, his voice just loud enough to carry. He had been in enough hostile standoffs to know when firepower wouldn't save them. She hadn't come here to win a firefight. She had come to win something larger: control of the narrative, control of the fear. And if he let panic dictate his team's actions, they would hand her victory before a single round was exchanged. She finally moved, lowering her rifle slightly and letting it rest across her chest. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the clearing. "You think you've come here to show strength," she said, eyes fixed on Cross. "But strength isn't standing behind rifles. It's knowing where to stand when no one else dares." The words weren't dramatic, weren't shouted, but they cut like a blade. Cross's jaw tightened. He wanted to call her bluff, to demand proof that her so-called strength could match the skill of his operators, but she had already shown it twice: the sniper from the ridge and the mines beneath their feet. Each proof had shattered his confidence piece by piece, and his men had felt it too. The battlefield wasn't theirs anymore, it was hers. He stepped forward another pace, letting his rifle drop just slightly, though his finger still hovered near the trigger. "You think this ends with you standing here and us walking away?" he said coldly. "That's not how this works. You don't get to dictate terms." Her expression didn't change. She didn't need it to. "I already have," she answered simply. And that was when the second wave appeared. More villagers emerged from the treeline, not armed this time but carrying stretchers, bundles of supplies, makeshift tools. Cross blinked in surprise as realization dawned. They weren't just fighters. They were building something. The clearing wasn't a battlefield, it was being turned into a camp, right under the noses of his men. She had walked into the kill zone not to destroy but to claim. Every moment his team stood frozen was another moment she transformed their ambush site into her ground. The weight of it sank into him. They had been ordered to secure a route, to protect a potential extraction point, but she had repurposed it before they even realized. The sniper on the ridge, the mines in the ground, the villagers arriving in waves, all of it was part of a pattern. She wasn't resisting them in the traditional sense. She was erasing their mission itself, showing them that their presence here was already obsolete. Cross felt a rare tremor of doubt slide down his spine. He had fought insurgents who relied on chaos and terror, but this was something different. This was strategy born from survival, sharpened by desperation into brilliance. One of his men muttered again, "Sir, what do we do? We can't just stand here." Cross ground his teeth. Every instinct told him to reassert dominance, to fire a warning shot, to push the villagers back, but the practical side of him knew better. A firefight here wouldn't end with victory. It would end with bodies, his men's, theirs, maybe even hers, but the mission would still be lost. And in war, losing the mission was worse than losing the fight. He forced himself to meet her eyes again. "What do you want?" he demanded, the words tasting bitter. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't take pleasure in his concession. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, speaking with the same calm certainty that had carried her through the kill zone. "Respect," she said. "And for you to remember that not everything you face can be measured by the length of your barrel or the weight of your orders." Her words landed harder than bullets. Cross felt the sting of them deep in his pride, but also deeper still, in a place that recognized truth when it couldn't be ignored. Around them, the villagers continued to spread, setting tools and supplies on the ground, forming a circle of resilience that no seal rifle could erase. His men looked to him for guidance, but for the first time in years he didn't have a clear answer. And that realization was more dangerous than any ambush. Cross had always believed that fear was a weapon, a double-edged blade he and his men were trained to wield better than anyone. But standing in that jungle clearing, surrounded by villagers who showed no fear, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. His men were trained to recognize threats, to neutralize them with precision, yet here they stood immobilized by the presence of one woman who had rewritten the entire battlefield without firing at them. Her single shot had shattered their perception, and her calm defiance gnawed at the confidence that usually kept a SEAL unit unshakable. Cross's jaw worked as he tried to read her again, trying to pin down her angle, her motive. She wasn't just stalling for time. She was doing something much more dangerous, teaching his men that they weren't the apex predators here. The villagers continued their slow transformation of the kill zone into a living camp. Some carried supplies deeper into the jungle, others spread tarps across branches, building makeshift shelters. Children appeared too, emerging cautiously from the treeline, clinging to the skirts of older women. Cross felt the sting of realization bite into him. She hadn't walked into their trap alone, she had brought a community, an entire hidden network that had lived beyond their intelligence reports. This wasn't a militia and it wasn't a military unit. It was a people bound together by something stronger than orders, survival and faith in her. And that faith was unshakable, because she had proven herself in ways even the most seasoned soldier would respect. The lieutenant adjusted his earpiece, whispering into the comms for the rear support unit to check for reinforcements. Static crackled back at him, then a strained voice answered, "Sir, comms are unstable. Signal interference, can't raise command." Cross froze. Signal interference here? That wasn't random. He turned his gaze back to her, suspicion sharpening into certainty. She had orchestrated this too. Whether by jamming devices scavenged from old conflicts or simply knowledge of where their signals died, she had cut them off from the wider net. His men were alone here and she knew it. She hadn't needed to surround them with firepower. Isolation was enough. She began to move again, slow deliberate steps, never breaking eye contact. Her rifle stayed lowered, but the tension her movements generated was worse than if she had raised it. Cross's men shifted uneasily, hands tightening on their triggers, breaths shallow and quick. They were warriors trained for fast, decisive violence, not psychological sieges. She stopped just short of the lieutenant, close enough that the weight of her presence pressed down on him like the heat. He could see her face clearly now, lines of dirt and exhaustion etched across her skin, but eyes so steady they might as well have been carved from iron. "You came here to show dominance," she said softly, low enough that only he and the men nearest could hear. "But you forgot the ground doesn't belong to you. It remembers every step, every body, every mistake. And it remembers me." Her words clawed at him. Cross wanted to snap back, to tell her that ground belonged to whoever controlled it with firepower, but something in her tone made his throat tighten. She wasn't boasting. She was reciting truth. He had seen villages break under the presence of SEAL teams before, watched enemies scatter when the black-clad silhouettes of his men emerged. Yet here, with rifles leveled and overwhelming training on their side, his team looked unsettled while her villagers grew stronger. She wasn't tearing at their bodies, she was unraveling their spirit. One of the younger SEALs, his nerves shredded thin, finally broke the silence. "Sir, she's playing us. Just give the word." His voice cracked, betraying the strain none of them wanted to admit. Cross looked at him, then back at her, and for the first time he hesitated. He knew that ordering fire would spill blood across the clearing, but it wouldn't end the battle. The villagers weren't here to scatter at the first sound of gunfire. They would swarm, they would resist, and they would bury his team under numbers and terrain advantage. Worse still, the woman wouldn't fall easily. He had already seen her precision, her calm. She would take at least some of his men with her, and the mission would dissolve into chaos. She seemed to sense his hesitation. Tilting her head slightly, she spoke again, louder now for all to hear. "Your officer told you no one could hit that shot. He was wrong. He told you this ground was secure. He was wrong. And he will keep being wrong if you keep following him without question." Her words struck like hammers against the fragile shell of their discipline. Cross's fists clenched, fury burning in his gut. She wasn't just challenging him, she was cutting at the bond between him and his men, undermining the trust that made them a unit. And it was working. He saw it in their eyes, doubt. The air in the clearing shifted, tension tightening into a noose. The villagers edged closer, not threatening but steady, encroaching with silent unity. The children's presence made it worse. No soldier wanted to fire on a child, and the sight of them clinging to their mothers added another layer of hesitation. The SEALs were trapped in an invisible cage, and every second it grew smaller. Cross's heart pounded as he realized she had taken his strongest asset, fear, and turned it against him. His men weren't afraid of her rifle. They were afraid of what she made them question, whether they were still in control. He needed to act, to reclaim the initiative before the doubt consumed them. Taking a step forward, he leveled his rifle squarely at her chest. "This ends now," he snapped, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Step back or I'll put you down." The words were sharp, commanding, but they rang hollow even to his own ears. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. Instead, she slowly raised her hand, pointing past him, toward the treeline his men had been too focused to check. Cross hesitated, then turned. And his blood ran cold. From the shadowed jungle emerged another line of villagers. But these weren't carrying tools or supplies. They carried rifles, heavy machine parts, scavenged RPGs, and boxes of ammunition. They set them down deliberately, methodically, as though laying claim to the space, as though daring the SEALs to try to stop them. Cross's chest tightened. They weren't just defending this place. They were establishing it as theirs, right under his nose, and he couldn't stop it without breaking every rule of engagement he lived by. He turned back to her, fury flaring, but her expression hadn't changed. Calm. Certain. Unshaken. This was never your battlefield, she said quietly. It was mine before you ever stepped here. And it will be mine long after you leave. Cross felt the truth of it pressed down like a weight on his chest. For the first time in years he stood on ground where his training meant less than hers, where his weapons meant less than her resolve. And the realization cut deeper than any wound. The clearing was suffocating now, thick with heat, silence, and the weight of choices that could no longer be postponed. Cross had faced firefights in deserts, jungles, and cities, stared down warlords who hid behind walls of gunmen, but never before had he felt the ground slip so completely from under him. Every second he delayed, she gained. Every glance his men exchanged, every bead of sweat on their foreheads, told him discipline was unraveling thread by thread. She hadn't fired at them, hadn't spilled a drop of blood, and still she had them cornered tighter than if she'd laid ambushes on every approach. The villagers' semicircle thickened, bodies pressed closer, weapons settling in their hands, not pointed yet but ready, and that readiness carried a message louder than any battle cry. Cross's chest ached from the tension. He wanted to call in air support, to unleash the kind of overwhelming fire that would shatter this fragile standoff, but comms remained dead. The interference had them cut off, blind, and he couldn't risk pulling his men deeper without knowing what awaited beyond the treeline. He hated admitting it even in silence, but she had them where she wanted them. She knew they were isolated, she knew their options were few, and she knew hesitation was eating them alive. The lieutenant gritted his teeth and forced himself to meet her gaze again. She hadn't moved an inch. Still standing there in the center of the kill zone, still carrying that infuriating calm, as if she already knew how this would end. One of the younger SEALs finally broke the fragile equilibrium, his voice rough with fear disguised as defiance. "We can't just sit here, sir. They're surrounding us." Cross shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "Stand your ground," he hissed. But even as he said it, he knew the cracks were spreading. Fear spread faster than orders, and once it took root, it was nearly impossible to kill. She saw it too. He could tell by the way her lips tightened slightly, not into a smile, not into triumph but into recognition. She knew his men were close to snapping, and she was letting the weight of silence finish the work she had started. Finally she raised her rifle again. Cross stiffened, every weapon in his team snapping toward her, fingers tightening on triggers. But she didn't aim at them. She aimed past them, high into the treeline once again. For a heartbeat, Cross thought she was bluffing, that this was just another performance meant to rattle them further. Then the crack of her shot split the air, and a shape tumbled from the canopy, a drone, one of their own, shattered into pieces as it hit the ground. Gasps rippled through the team. They hadn't even realized it had been compromised, hadn't realized someone had hijacked their own eyes in the sky. And she had taken it out in a single shot, denying them what little surveillance they still trusted. Cross's throat went dry. He could feel the morale drain from his men like water from a cracked canteen. She had killed their sniper, revealed their minds, jammed their comms, and now destroyed their drone. Piece by piece, she had stripped them of every advantage they carried. And she had done it with the patience of someone who understood that battles weren't won in bursts of fire, but in the slow grind of taking away certainty until nothing remained. She turned her eyes back on Cross, and for the first time he saw something flicker there, not arrogance, not mockery, but pity. "You don't see it yet," she said, voice low, steady, carrying just enough for him and his nearest men to hear. "You think strength is your training, your rifles, your orders? But strength is walking through your kill zone alive when you swore no one could." Her words carved at him, each syllable cutting deeper than a blade. He hated her calm, hated her certainty, hated the way she made his men question. But most of all he hated the truth in her voice. She had walked into his trap, and now it felt like he was the one standing exposed in hers. Another villager stepped forward from the treeline then, older, shoulders bent from years of labor, carrying a battered radio. He set it on the ground between them with deliberate slowness, then stepped back. Cross's eyes narrowed, suspicion burning through him. A trap? A mockery? The woman tilted her head toward it. "You want comms?" she said evenly. "Here. But understand, when you speak you're not just calling command. You're admitting you've already lost." Cross's hand twitched toward the device, then froze. He knew what she was doing. If he used it, it would look like surrender to his men. If he didn't, he was admitting she had cut them off completely. Either way, she had forced him into a corner. Rage surged in his chest, hot and violent, but there was nowhere to put it. She hadn't given him an enemy he could shoot, a target he could neutralize. She had given him choices, all of them poisoned. Behind him, one of his men finally snapped. "This is bull, sir, we need to move. We're sitting ducks out here." The words rang loud, defiant, and for the first time Cross saw more than one head nod in agreement. His men were fracturing, discipline slipping. She had managed what bullets and blades rarely could, breaking the bond of absolute confidence between an officer and his unit. And once broken, that bond was nearly impossible to repair. Cross's vision tunneled. He raised his rifle again, aiming squarely at her chest, trying to reclaim control through force of will. "This ends with you," he snarled. "One more step and you're finished." The threat carried weight, his finger hovering near the trigger, but his words sounded brittle against the weight of the jungle. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. Instead, she let the silence stretch until it hurt, then spoke in that same maddening calm. "You've already lost, Lieutenant. The only choice left is how much you'll sacrifice before you admit it." The words cut deeper than gunfire. He saw his men's eyes flicker, not with defiance, but with the dawning awareness that she was right. And in that moment, Cross realized the battlefield was no longer his. It hadn't been since the second she stepped into the kill zone. The jungle didn't wait forever. It never did. Silence could stretch, tension could hang, but sooner or later the air snapped, and violence came rushing in like floodwater. Cross could feel it building, the way seasoned soldiers felt storms before the clouds even gathered. His men were jittery, their discipline unraveling strand by strand, the villagers' semicircle closing tighter, the woman's steady calm gnawing at them like acid. Something had to give. He wanted to believe it would be her, that eventually her calm would crack, her certainty would falter, but every second proved otherwise. She hadn't budged. She hadn't flinched. And the villagers drew strength from that. They weren't fighters in uniform, but they stood with weapons in hand, their eyes sharp, their resolve iron. It was the kind of resolve that didn't break when bullets flew. Cross's radio hissed faintly in his ear, the interference spiking before fading. Fragments of a signal bled through, static, half a voice, then nothing. He cursed under his breath. Command was unreachable. No reinforcements, no air support, no clean extraction plan. They were alone, and she had engineered it that way. He knew now that she hadn't just walked into their kill zone blind, she had mapped it, dismantled it, turned it inside out. And he hated her for it. Every instinct screamed at him to retake control, to reassert dominance, but how? Shooting her would ignite the villagers. Pulling back would look like retreat. Doing nothing would rot his men's morale until they broke on their own. The choice was slipping away when it happened. A single mistake, tiny but enough. One of the younger SEALs, nerves frayed raw, shifted his rifle too quickly. The barrel swung across a villager carrying a stretcher. The man flinched, stumbled, and the stretcher toppled, supplies spilling into the dirt. That tiny spark was all it took. A shout ripped from the villagers' line, sharp and furious, and weapons snapped up in response. Cross's men jerked into motion instantly, rifles rising, bodies tensing for the inevitable storm. The woman didn't shout. She didn't need to. She simply raised her hand, palm out, holding her people in place. For a few heartbeats, the clearing froze again, but it was different now. This was no longer a standoff. This was the breath before the plunge. Cross's chest burned. He knew it was seconds away. He wanted to call for restraint, to salvage some sliver of control, but rage was clawing too hard at his throat. Rage at her, rage at his men for breaking discipline, rage at himself for letting her dictate the terms. His voice cracked through the tension like a whip. "Weapons ready? Hold the line." The villagers stiffened at the command, their eyes darting to her for direction. She gave none. Not yet. Her stillness was worse than action, because it meant she was waiting for him to fall further into the trap. And then, finally, the first shot came, not from her, not from his men, but from somewhere in the treeline, a crack of a rifle that dropped one of the villagers near the edge. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouts tore through the air, villagers surging forward with weapons raised, SEALs snapping into firing lines. Cross didn't hesitate this time. He bellowed the order and his men unleashed controlled bursts, the jungle exploding with the thunder of rifles. Villagers dropped, but not before returning fire, bullets slamming into trees, dirt, and steel. The clearing that had held silence for so long now screamed with violence. The woman didn't stay in the center. The second the first round cracked, she moved, flowing like water to the side, her rifle snapping up with mechanical precision. Cross tracked her through his scope, but before he could fire, she dropped one of his men with a shot to the shoulder, non-lethal, precise, a message. She wasn't gunning for slaughter. She was crippling, disabling, showing control even in battle. Cross roared in frustration, shifting his aim, but she melted back into the chaos, blending with the villagers as if the jungle itself had swallowed her. His men fought fiercely, disciplined bursts carving gaps in the charging line, but the villagers' numbers pressed like a tide. And worse, the villagers weren't reckless. They didn't charge blindly. They moved with coordination, with intent, covering one another, pulling the wounded back. Cross realized with a sick twist of his gut that she had trained them, molded them into something far more dangerous than desperate civilians. They weren't soldiers, not by doctrine, but they were something he feared more. Survivors who knew their land, who fought with purpose deeper than any paycheck or mission briefing. He ducked behind cover as rounds chewed bark from the tree near his head. His earpiece crackled again, fragments of panicked voices, then cut to silence. No help. No airstrike. Just them and her. He peeked around the trunk, eyes sweeping, trying to catch sight of her. His men needed her taken out, needed the symbol broken if they were going to stand a chance of turning this fight. Then he saw her again, weaving through the chaos, calm as ever, firing only when necessary. Each shot dropped a man with surgical precision. Not killing but breaking lines, forcing retreats, unraveling their cohesion. She was dismantling his team the way she had dismantled their confidence earlier, one threat at a time. Cross's blood pounded. He lined her up in his scope, finger pressing hard against the trigger. This time he wouldn't hesitate. This time he would end it. But just as he squeezed, she shifted as if she had felt his intent, the round tearing bark instead of flesh. She turned her head, eyes locking with his through the chaos, and for a heartbeat, time froze. There was no fear in her gaze. Only recognition. And then she vanished again, swallowed by smoke, gunfire, and movement. Around him, his men were faltering. 2 down with wounds, another pinned by suppressing fire. The villagers pressed closer, their shouts a chorus that shook the air. Cross's fury burned, but beneath it was a darker truth he couldn't shake. She hadn't entered the kill zone to die. She had entered it to win. And unless he found a way to break her hold over this battlefield, she would. The clearing had become a crucible of fire and fury. Smoke clung to the air, hanging heavy, every breath carrying the bite of gunpowder. Cross crouched low, rifle pressed against his shoulder, sweat cutting trails through grime on his face. Around him his men scrambled, barking orders, shouting warnings, returning fire in sharp, controlled bursts, but it wasn't enough. For every villager that fell, 2 more seemed to surge forward. And through it all, she moved like a shadow, untethered, never frantic, never reckless. He caught glimpses of her, slipping behind cover, raising her weapon, dropping another man with a shot too precise to be luck. She was everywhere, commanding without words, guiding the villagers like the tide pushes waves. Cross hated her for it, but deeper than that hate was the gnawing, corrosive truth. He was starting to fear her. He lunged sideways as bullets shredded the log he'd been hiding behind. Dirt spat into his eyes and he swiped it away with the back of his glove. His heart thudded like a drum in his chest, but his mind stayed sharp. He couldn't allow panic, not now, not in front of his men. They needed to see strength, even if it was a mask stitched from desperation. He shouted over the chaos, rallying his men, urging them to hold their formation, to keep their discipline. But discipline meant little when morale cracked, and morale was crumbling with every precise shot she fired. They'd trained for war zones, for insurgents, for missions deep in hostile territory, but they hadn't trained for a lone woman who walked into their kill zone without fear and turned it into her ground. Another of his men cried out, clutching his leg as blood poured from a wound. Cross grabbed him by the vest and dragged him behind a tree, shoving a tourniquet into his hands. "Stay with me, you're fine," he barked, though he didn't know if it was true. He spun back, snapping off shots into the undergrowth, but every round felt wasted. She wasn't there anymore. He could feel it, her presence, her direction, but she wasn't in his crosshairs. She was above them somehow, beyond them, orchestrating the chaos like a conductor with an invisible baton. And that terrified him more than bullets. Then through the haze he saw her again. This time she wasn't moving between villagers. She was advancing. Directly. Toward him. His breath caught as he tracked her through the scope. She wasn't running, wasn't charging, she was walking measured steps, rifle slung at her side, eyes locked on him. As though the battle had shrunk to just the 2 of them, as though none of the chaos around them mattered. For the first time in years, Cross felt his finger tremble on the trigger. This wasn't normal. No one walked like that into a storm of bullets and shrapnel. No one. He fired. The round snapped out, striking inches from her foot, kicking dirt into the air. She didn't flinch. He fired again. Another near miss. Still she came. And then suddenly he couldn't shoot. Not because of his weapon, not because of a jam, but because something in her gaze locked him in place. His men saw her too, rifles pivoting, shouts rising as they prepared to unleash hell. But she raised her weapon before they could, fired 2 shots so fast they blurred into one, and both struck rifles out of hands without hitting flesh. The precision was surgical, terrifying. The SEALs froze in disbelief, staring at their disarmed weapons on the ground. She moved between them like water, swift and controlled, rifle never fully raised, never firing without purpose. Cross's fury boiled over. This was his moment, his chance to end it. He roared, broke cover and charged toward her, rifle up, teeth bared like a predator. But she was ready. She pivoted, graceful and efficient, catching his barrel with her hand and twisting. The movement wrenched the weapon sideways, shots ripping harmlessly into the dirt. Cross swung a fist, raw brute force behind it, but she ducked low, driving her shoulder into his chest. He staggered back, the air blasting from his lungs, but he didn't fall. He reset, raising his rifle again. She was already inside his guard, already too close. The butt of her rifle slammed into his jaw, sending white sparks across his vision. He stumbled, dropped to one knee, but fury dragged him back up. The two circled now, the chaos of the battle muffled by the thunder of blood in his ears. Around them, the SEALs and villagers had slowed, their fight drawn toward this duel, eyes locked on the collision between their leaders. He felt it too, the gravity of the moment, the sense that everything had funneled to this point. He swung again, heavier this time, desperate, reckless. She slipped past the blow, seized his vest, and used his own momentum to drag him to the ground. They hit the dirt hard, rolling, his rifle skittering out of reach. He fought like an animal, grappling, clawing, straining for leverage, but she moved with precision, every strike calculated. He wasn't weak, he was stronger than most men, but she had something strength couldn't touch. Control. At last she pinned him. Her knee pressed into his chest, her rifle angled at his throat. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. Her calm eyes bore into his, and he knew it was over. Around them, silence rippled outward, both sides pausing as the sight burned into their minds. Their leader, the decorated SEAL officer, pinned and powerless beneath the weight of the woman who had walked into his kill zone without fear. Cross snarled, struggling beneath her, spitting rage like venom. Do it. If you're going to kill me, then do it. His chest heaved, his voice cracked, his pride bleeding out with his words. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice low but steady, a whisper sharp enough to cut through the roar in his head. This was never your ground. It never will be. The words cut deeper than any blade. He bucked again, trying to throw her off, but she pressed the rifle harder against his throat, not enough to kill, just enough to remind him she could. His men shifted uncertainly, weapons half raised, waiting for his command, waiting for her move. The villagers stood firm, their eyes alight with vindication. The clearing, once filled with thunder, now held a silence more deafening than gunfire. Cross realized in that silence what had happened. He had already lost. The kill zone wasn't his. It never had been. She had claimed it, reshaped it, owned it, not with brute force but with something he'd never been taught to fight, fearlessness. And as she stepped back, rising and letting him breathe, she didn't look like a victor basking in triumph. She looked like a storm that had passed, calm, steady, inevitable. The silence in the clearing stretched long, heavier than the smoke that still curled in the air. Cross lay on the ground, chest heaving, his throat raw where the rifle had pressed against it. His men stood frozen, uncertain, caught between loyalty to their commander and the undeniable truth carved into the dirt before them. The woman, the one they had mocked, underestimated and tried to break, stood above him with her rifle lowered, calm as though she had not just turned a battlefield upside down. Her presence filled the clearing more than gunfire ever could. It was not rage that gave her power, nor cruelty. It was the steady, unshaken defiance of someone who had never surrendered to fear. And in that moment, every man present, SEAL or villager, knew she had won. Cross pushed himself up slowly, his pride bleeding heavier than the cut at his temple. His jaw clenched so tightly he thought it might shatter. Everything inside him screamed to lunge, to prove that he wasn't beaten, but even he understood futility when it stared him down with eyes steady and unblinking. She hadn't humiliated him. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't even gloated. That was worse. Because it meant his defeat was complete, not just on the ground but in the hearts of everyone watching. His authority had cracked and the fracture could never be mended. Stand down, she said finally, her voice carrying not as a plea but as a command, clear enough to cut through the tension. It was directed at his men, not him. They shifted uneasily, glancing between one another, between the villagers, between their officer. Cross wanted to snarl at them to fight, to remind them who they were, what their insignia meant. But the words stuck in his throat. He could feel it in them already. Their discipline, drilled hard through years of training, was fraying under something deeper, the realization that she had accomplished what they had believed impossible. She had walked into the kill zone without armor, without backup, without fear, and she had not just survived, she had taken command of it. One by one the rifles lowered. Not dropped, not thrown aside, lowered in silent acknowledgement. Cross's stomach turned. The villagers murmured among themselves, their voices rising with pride, with relief, with vindication. Some moved to collect the wounded, others to secure weapons from the disarmed SEALs. But no one touched her. She didn't need anyone at her side. She stood alone, but she stood taller than anyone else there. Cross staggered to his feet, his legs trembling not from injury but from the weight of shame. He forced himself to meet her eyes, but it felt like staring into a mirror that reflected every weakness he'd buried over years of training. "This isn't over," he growled, though the words tasted like ashes. She tilted her head slightly, a faint trace of something like pity crossing her face. "For you it is." The words struck harder than her rifle had. She didn't say them loud, but they rippled through the clearing like thunder. His men heard it. The villagers heard it. And though no one spoke, Cross knew they all believed it. His chest heaved, fury clawing at his insides, but there was no outlet left. She had disarmed not just his rifle but his authority, his reputation, his very identity as a commander. In the kill zone he had crafted, she had stripped him bare. Around him, his men began to back away, not in retreat but in quiet withdrawal, lowering their eyes as though unwilling to meet his. They weren't abandoning him entirely, but the bond between commander and soldier had frayed in a way that could not be repaired with orders or threats. They had seen something today that would live with them forever. Proof that strength and training alone did not guarantee victory. Proof that courage, the kind unshaken by intimidation, was a weapon more dangerous than any rifle. Cross turned, jaw rigid, and began to walk. Each step away felt like betrayal of everything he had claimed to be, but staying would have been worse. His men followed at a distance, silent, heads low. Not one of them spoke as they faded into the tree line, leaving behind the kill zone that no longer belonged to them. The villagers exhaled as though a storm had finally broken. The tension that had clung to their shoulders eased, replaced by something brighter, hope. They moved to embrace one another, to tend wounds, to gather the fallen. Children peeked from behind huts, eyes wide with the awe that only comes from witnessing the impossible. And at the center of it all, she stood quietly, her rifle resting against her shoulder, her expression steady and unreadable. She did not raise her arms in triumph. She did not shout or celebrate. Victory to her was not something to flaunt, it was simply survival, earned through resolve. One of the elders approached her, voice trembling with gratitude. "You saved us. You stood when none of us could." She shook her head softly. "No. I just reminded you that you could stand. You were never powerless." The words spread among the villagers, lifting them more than victory itself. She had not fought for glory or command, she had fought to return strength to those who had been stripped of it. In her eyes, they were not victims rescued by a savior. They were people who had rediscovered their courage, their right to stand on their own ground. That was why she had won, not because she was stronger but because she had given others the power to believe they weren't weak. Night fell slowly, painting the clearing in shades of blue and gray. Fires flickered to life as the villagers tended wounds and mourned losses. Yet there was no despair in their mourning, only resilience, only unity. And as they gathered around her, she stepped back, never seeking the center of their circle, never asking for devotion. She had not come to lead them, but to remind them they already had leaders among themselves. Far beyond the treeline, Cross walked in silence, his men trailing behind. Shame clung to him like a second skin, and in the pit of his chest, bitterness festered. He replayed every second of their clash, every strike, every word, until it became unbearable. He told himself it had been luck, skill, trickery, anything but what it truly was. But no matter how many excuses he whispered to himself in the dark, he could not erase the memory of her eyes. Steady, unshaken, fearless. Eyes that had looked at him not as a commander, not even as a threat, but as a man who had already lost before the first shot was fired. The villagers would tell stories of that day for years. Children would grow up hearing how a woman with no armor, no platoon, no flag, had walked into the kill zone and changed everything. Some would call her a warrior, others a savior, others a legend. But she herself would carry no title, claim no throne. She would simply remain what she had always been, A woman who had refused to bow, who had proven that courage alone could shatter even the most disciplined steel. And somewhere in the depths of his shame, Cross knew those stories would outlive him. No medal he had ever earned, no mission he had ever led, would weigh heavier in memory than the day a simple woman had stood against him, and won. The end.